shoot ski.
Tim, get Tim.
And then
Get
after the
Tim.
war was over, well, they were going to train us, you know, for an invasion. That would have been a bloody mess with no good pop guns, you know.
Right.
And didn't have enough points to come back, so I had to go down to the Philippines. And I got up to Baguio, and I didn't know enough. I wasn't skilled at golf, so I really didn't get much out of that, except just sightseeing. And we had lots of fuel, so we could take a command car and drive around. So I saw all I wanted to see of the Philippines. But I met some people that, you know, made you want to cry.
My name is Bob Feynman. I was born between DE Day and DJ Day. I have several neighbors, Dick Gooch, Jim Farrington, Rick Richter, who did some unbelievable things during the Second World War. People like me learn about it from picture books like this one.
Just want to make sure I'll do
This is the USS Yorktown in the Battle of Midway. I don't know if you all recognize the Victory at Sea tape that you were watching. In the early 1950s, Victory at Sea was a very popular TV show. They gave me a book in 1952, and so I studied it religiously. And I don't know what you want to call it, became a fan, so to speak, somebody who was really interested in the Second World War. Here's another book. And what you see at the top picture here is the USS Yorktown on about a 30-degree angle with a bunch of people running around on the deck trying to save it. And I always pictured our speaker, Jim Farrington, as being one of these people running around in this picture trying to save the aircraft carrier. He has some very interesting stories about what happened to that aircraft carrier during the battle and after the battle, and eventually when it was sunk. So what I want to do now, before I introduce Jim, is I'd like to get the lights turned down and play the rest of this film, because you're going to see on the film what actually happened during the battle. It's a pretty accurate description of what happened, and it's from the Victory at Sea tape in 1952. So we had a projectionist. He was there a second ago. He's still there. We'll go. We'll turn this off in a second. This is the next rendition of whatever they're going on to. Stop it. I asked Jim to talk to us about what it was like in late May, June, July of 1942 around Midway, Pearl Harbor.
Good afternoon. If you have no objections, I'll go back even a step further. It'll be easy for that better?
Yeah.
It'll be easy for some of you in the room to go back to 1940, and others it'll be kind of a stretch of your imagination because of your present age. But in 1940, I was assigned to the United States aircraft carrier Yorktown, officially designated as CV-5. It was the third Yorktown in the history of the United States Navy. Since that time, there has been one more commissioned, and that was designated as CV-10. In any event, in 1940, the Yorktown, along with other ships of the United States Navy, were stationed in the Hawaiian area, working out of Pearl Harbor. Times were good, even though England was at war with Germany, and they were having very severe difficulties in the European theater. In Hawaii, the sun still shone, The beaches were still sandy. There were 2 hotels in the Waikiki area, the old Royal Hawaiian and the Aloha Hotel. You got to Waikiki from downtown by streetcar, and as far as the ships, we would leave Pearl Harbor normally Monday morning, go out to sea until sometime Friday afternoon, conducting maneuvers and various other types of activities, and life was good. The isolationists in the United States were still able to keep us out of the conflict in Europe. However, in the early part of 1941, a decision was made to render further assistance to England and over in the European theater. As a result, in April of 1941, the Yorktown was assigned to the Atlantic Ocean. We left Pearl Harbor in secrecy, and on about the 6th, I think it was, or so of May, we traversed the Panama Canal in the middle of the night, once again because of the secrecy involved. We proceeded from the Panama Canal to Bermuda, where a supply ship was supposed to provision us because we had left Pearl Harbor in such a hurry that we hadn't been fully provisioned. The supply ship, for whatever reasons, did not show up for several days. We lay at anchor in the Bermuda waters until it did show up and finally provisioned us. During that time, however, the food, provisions, and various other supplies that were necessary to operate the ship began to run low. We got down to the point where at least they told us that the last steak on board would be raffled off. And it was, and some lucky person won the raffle and had a big steak dinner up on the flight deck of the ship. The rest of us survived until the provisions showed up on soda crackers and chili. But the excellent cooks that we had aboard got around that problem by constantly changing the menu. So at breakfast you could have soda crackers and chili. Lunchtime it would be chili and soda crackers. Then for the evening dinner you could have a combination of both. That was your choice. But in any event, as I say, the supplies finally arrived and we went back to eating normally. The purpose of transferring us to the Atlantic Ocean was to engage in what was called a neutrality patrol. We and other ships would operate out of Norfolk, Virginia. We would go up off the coast of Canada, Newfoundland, pick up convoys, go up off the coast of Iceland, and down off the coast of Africa and back into Norfolk, and escorting convoys of merchant ships that were going to the European theater. During that time, there were supposedly orders to the German Navy not to engage in any combat with the U.S. ships. We were not aware of that, so we were constantly on guard, standing 4 on, 4 off watches, night and day, and this continued on, and we made a total of, I think it was about 4 different patrols until we had just come into Norfolk a few days earlier when the Japanese struck Pearl Harbor. At that time, in the Pacific, there were only three carriers. You had the Enterprise, the Lexington, and the Saratoga. The Saratoga was laid up over in Bremerton, being repaired and some changes being made in her structures and so forth. So that left the Lexington and the Enterprise as the only two active carriers in the Pacific Ocean at that time. As we were in the Atlantic with the carriers Ranger, Wasp, and Hornet. So there were four carriers in the Atlantic and only two operational carriers at that time in the Pacific. We were immediately transferred back to the Pacific, and we left Norfolk on the 16th of December, arrived in San Diego on the 30th of December, picked up a contingent of Marines, escorted them out to American Samoa, Tutuila, and Pango Pango, then cruised in the Pacific area, and we made various raids, that is air raids, on the Marshall Gilbert Islands, Shalouette, Macken, the Mealy atolls, but primarily we're trying to stay hidden until the U.S. forces could be strengthened and become totally operational. On the 14th of February of 1941, we went back into Pearl Harbor, which was of course still a mess. And ships were still laying on the bottom of Pearl Harbor. The damage and the conflagration and so forth that had been caused on December 7th had not been cleared up. They were working on it, but it was so great that it took a long time to clean it up out there. In February of that year, we went in, as I say, and then left Pearl Harbor after being reprovisioned and supplied. We were then engaged in raids in Salamaua, the Lae, New Guinea areas, the Tulagi, Javatu, a couple of others that I can't even read my own notes. But anyway, we were quite active in mostly airstrikes and operating with a task force under, at that time, Admiral Jack Fletcher, Black Jack Fletcher, they called him. And then in the meantime, we had apparently successfully broken the Japanese secret codes. So we were beginning to get information that would not have otherwise been available to us, which led up to an activity that became known as the Coral Sea Battle. At the Coral Sea, the Lexington and the Yorktown were the two carriers involved, and during that battle, the Yorktown was severely hit. The Lexington was sunk, not by the enemy. She was badly damaged by the enemy to the extent that they could not recover her, but rather than leave her floating, she was subsequently sunk by one of our own destroyers' torpedoes. And as I say, the Yorktown was badly damaged. We went back into Pearl Harbor shortly thereafter. According to the maritime engineers and people that were involved in making those decisions, we were scheduled for anywhere from 3 to 6 months of repairs, depending on whose assessment was being looked at. Admiral Nimitz, of course, at that time still only had 4 stars, as I recall. But 4 stars do a lot of things, as any of you in the military know. So the 4 stars decided that the Yorktown could be put back in serviceable condition in 3 days. And the 4 stars, of course, prevailed. So we went into Pearl Harbor on the 27th of May, and we came out of Pearl Harbor on the 30th of May. Now, of course, during that period of time, they worked night and day to accomplish the repairs and the changes that needed to be made. And everybody worked and worked and worked and worked. Because, as I say, 4 stars prevailed. We went out of Pearl Harbor fully provisioned, armed, and so forth, but not in 100% occupational condition due to the damages that we had sustained in the Coral Sea, but operational. As a result of that condition, the Yorktown was assigned in supposedly a more or less rear area of the upcoming battle at Midway, because, as I said earlier, due to the fact that we had broken the Japanese code, we were aware, now nobody's telling me this, these are things that I learned later on, but we became aware that the Japanese were attempting and had a strong strike force approaching Midway. They used an attack in Alaska in the Attu area to supposedly throw us off guard, but their main objective was Midway. And the decision by whoever made it, approved by Admiral Nimitz, determined that Midway was the actual area of accomplishment for the Japanese. So our forces were focused on the Midway situation. We went into the Battle of Midway on June the 4th. The American forces and the Australian forces and Canadian forces that were involved in that battle successfully damaged or sunk many of the attacking Japanese ships. Our damage, among others, but was primarily the Yorktown. The Yorktown was attacked twice on June the 4th. Once in the early afternoon where we were bombed and strafed and lost several people. Then that was, and actually knocked out of commission. We lost power. They were able to restore the power within a reasonably short period of time, and we sustained a second attack on the same day, the afternoon, later in the afternoon, beginning approximately 3 o'clock in the afternoon that time. We were hit by 2 torpedoes, as well as bombs and strafing and so forth. As a result of the damage we sustained in the second attack, we were dead in the water again. The ship was listing approximately 30 degrees to port. Now, 30 degrees is about like that. It wasn't possible to determine what was going to happen to the ship. You've got approximately 3,000 people aboard. The thinking was, apparently, that she was going to continue listing and subsequently roll over, and there was no way known at that time to save her. There was no power, there was no means of defense that she had because she'd lost all power. So the order was made to abandon ship, which was done. Most everybody, rather than going off on the low side, went off on the high side because of the fear, as I say, that she was going to roll over. I jumped in the water after having given some fellow that told me he couldn't swim, and I still don't know whether he was telling me the truth or not. But anyway, I knew I could swim, and I gave him my life jacket and jumped in the water along with everybody else. I was picked up by the destroyer Hughes, where I was able to shower, get the diesel oil off of me, and they issued me new clothes, a pair of dungarees, shirt, and skivvies, and a pair of shoes, and that's all I had. The next morning, now keep in mind, 1941 we're talking about. I was a little younger. Excuse me, 1942. I was a little younger than what I am right now. So when they asked for volunteers, I hadn't quite gained the knowledge that I hopefully have by now. I immediately volunteered to go back aboard the Yorktown. The primary purpose of going back was to determine if all of the code books and secret material had been removed. Because, as I say, nobody at that point knew exactly what was going to happen to the ship. We went aboard in the destroyer's whaleboat. Now, those of you who are not aware of it, the whaleboat, at least in those days, was about 26 feet long. There were about 8 or 10 of us that got into it. We took them aboard. We went aboard on the port side, the low side, climbed aboard, and as we went back aboard the Yorktown, I heard pounding coming from somewhere below. The officer in charge of the group was not particularly interested at that point in the pounding. He wanted to get up on the bridge and then in the operational area above decks to check, as I say, on any material that might have been inadvertently left. So we directed that group to where they wanted to go. I took about three fellows with me, 3 men with me, and we started trying to determine where the pounding was coming from. And we would crack a hatch. If there was water in that compartment, we would close the hatch and go on to another one. We finally ended up down in the sickbay area. Now, as I said, there was no power, so all we had for light was battle lanterns. And flashing the battle lanterns around in the sickbay, which was dry, I happened to notice a movement over in one of the bunks. Went over, and there was a person there, a body, I thought at first. But when I got over and shined the light in the man's face, he opened his eyes, and he was alive. And he briefly moved his hand like this, pointing to one of the other bunks. I shone the light over there, and there was another person in that bunk. We looked around the rest of the sick bay, didn't see anybody else. We made arrangements to get those 2 men off, and they were taken back aboard the Hughes and subsequently wherever they were taken. To interject just for a moment, weeks later, when I finally got back into Alameda in California, the Alameda Naval Station, and a fellow came up to me one day and he said, "You're Farrington, aren't you?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "I'm so-and-so." He said, "I'm one of the fellows that you took out of sick bay on the Yorktown." And I said, "Oh, geez, I'm glad you made it." I said, "How about the other fellow?" And he said, "He didn't make it. He died sometime between the time they removed him from the Yorktown and wherever they took him." I don't know the man's name, and it's immaterial, but at least we got him out. Then later that tug Vireo showed up. She shot a tow line over, and the way they do that, they have a short metal rod that they put in their gun, and attached to this short metal rod is a light line or string, and that's shot over. Then that lighter line is attached to a heavier line, and subsequently a heavier line, and you pull it all in, and eventually you get a tow line, which we did. Then we jury-rigged a connection up on the forecastle of the Yorktown, and the Vireo took us in tow. Later that day, I went to the Vireo. Now, during this period of time, keep in mind, there's a big dead hulk of a ship, approximately 1,000 feet long, laying dead in the water, listing 30 degrees to port. The only protection that was in the area was the one destroyer that I had been on, the Hughes, and she kept circling the horizon in case some submarine showed up. Hopefully would find it. I spent the night on the Vireo, the tug. The next day, they organized a large supply party because a decision had made that the ship was hopefully going to last. I say supply party, salvage party. So the salvage party went aboard on the morning of the 6th, and they started lightening the low side of the ship, cutting the big guns off, pushed whatever planes were there over the side in order to lighten it so that they could straighten it up, and in the meantime she was under tow. Sometime in the afternoon of the 6th, there were machine gun firing. And of course, everybody at that point is a little jittery, to say the least. So everybody ducked for cover. Well, what turned out, one of the gunners made strikers off the Yorktown that was on this salvage party where they were dismantling the guns and so forth to lighten her, and inadvertently fired one of the machine guns up on the starboard forward catwalk. Probably a 40 millimeter, maybe a 50 millimeter gun, I don't know which, is small, relatively small gun. So that was the only other gun that was fired since we had abandoned ship. Prior to abandoning ship, the gun that I was the gun captain of, a 5-inch 38 caliber, gun number 4 up on the port forward portion of the ship. After the second attack, the gun jammed. We tried to reload it. The battery officer had left. The gunner's mate attached to the 2 guns up there had left. And we attempted to clear the jam. Now, a 5-inch gun, you have a projectile and you have a powder can or powder case. The projectile goes in first, then the powder case is loaded, then an automatic ram pushes both of them into the breech. The gun closes up and is ready to fire. The projectile was in the breech. The ram, because of the lack of power, would not operate. There's a manual means of operating it. We tried the manual means, that wouldn't work. So I took what I call a ramrod that they use to clean out the barrels, a long wooden pole, and cleared the other men from around the gun, and hopefully would hit the ram rather than the powder can and the priming pin, and ram it home. I was successful after several tries. At that time, the gun is loaded. The only way to unload it, because there was no power, was to do it manually. So we pointed the gun in a direction where we hoped we wouldn't hit anybody or anything, and unloaded it so that it was ready, hopefully, because we didn't know whether another attack was coming or not. That was the last gun fired on purpose on the Yorktown. The machine gun that I just talked about was the last gun fired by any means or for any purpose. On the afternoon of the 6th of June, we had the destroyer Hammond tied up alongside the port side, or the starboard side of the Yorktown, the starboard quarter, back part of the ship on the right side, furnishing power and pumps and so forth to the salvage crew that was aboard. Suddenly, torpedo wakes were seen coming from the starboard side. A Japanese submarine had fired 4 torpedoes. 2 of them again hit the Yorktown on the starboard side. 1 hit the Hammond, broke her in half. She went down within 3 minutes. As she went down, and I've never heard the straight story on this, as to why it happened. My guess is that when they saw the torpedo wakes approaching, the Hammond sounded general quarters. When general quarters are sounded, everybody goes to their battle station. The people in charge of the depth charges are automatically trained to arm the depth charges, then are subsequently given the depth at which they are to explode, because the charges are set just like a anti-aircraft projectile. The anti-aircraft projectile is set to explode at a certain altitude. Depth charges are set to explode at a certain depth. In any event, the ship went down within 3 minutes. The whole crew was in the water, including some men off the Yorktown that had jumped in as well. As she went down, the depth charges started going off, which caught many of the Hammond's crew due to the concussion. As I said, I was in the Vireo, the tug. The fear was that as if the Yorktown went down, which she easily could have with another 2 torpedoes in her, that she would pull the Vireo down with her because of the tow line. I grabbed a fire axe and tried to cut the tow line. Well, the tow line is a large steel cable. I couldn't dent it any more than I can this table with my fingernails. But one of their crew came along with a cutting torch and they cut the tow line. Then we proceeded to look for survivors in the water. And for some reason or another, they didn't have anybody aboard the Vireo that could operate their whaleboat. So I, again, young and full of vim and vigor, volunteered to get in there and operate the whaleboat for them, which I did. And a couple of fellows jumped in and we went out looking for survivors. There weren't many. There were a lot of things floating out there, but very few live people. The next morning, the ship, the Yorktown, finally went down. There was still hope that she would remain floating, but as dawn approached on the morning of the 7th of June, why it became apparent that she was going deeper and deeper. The list was getting greater and greater, and about 7 o'clock or so in the morning, she finally went down. I went from there to one of the other ships, I don't know, one of the other destroyers, subsequently ended up back in Hawaii. And we were under orders not to divulge any of the things that had happened. They didn't want the news out that the Yorktown had been sunk. The group that I was with ended up in a little place called Lualua on the island of Oahu, which is back in the boondocks. And that's where the Red Cross and I on my part developed a animosity that I still carry with me today. But I'll take a brief moment and relay it to you. The group that I was with, the only thing we had were the clothes on our back which had been given to us. No toothbrushes, no toothpaste, no razors, no combs, which I could still use in those days. So they put us in this Lualua. As I found out afterwards, it was an ammunition operation out in the boondocks of Oahu in Hawaii. They assigned us some tents and cots. The cot that I had a big slit in the canvas so that you had to drape a leg over one of the sides of it to keep from falling out through the slit. So we were not particularly happy campers that first night. But the next morning things looked brighter because there was a little bamboo shack close by where we were sleeping, and a fella came along and opened it up, and it had a big Red Cross sign that you could see on the inside, and back on the shelves there was toothpaste and toothbrushes and combs and razors and so forth. So we figured this is where we get the things that we need. So we lined up. I think I was first in line, and I went up to the counter and told the fellow behind it, I need toothpaste, I need this and that and so forth. So he laid it on the counter, and I went to scoop it up, and he said, that'll be whatever the price was. I don't know, $1, $2, whatever. I said, what are you talking about? Well, this is so much, this is so much, this is so much. So the price comes to whatever. I said, you must be kidding. I said, this is the Red Cross, isn't it? And he said, yes, this is a Red Cross operation. I said, well, hey, nobody here has a penny on them. We don't know when we're going to get any. The only thing we have is the clothes on our back. And we thought that the Red Cross would supply us. He said, no, nothing doing. I said, well, you know what you can do with this stuff, and pushed it back to him. Well, fortunately, later on, some arrangements were made, not with the Red Cross, but with the Navy, through the commissary or someplace. We were finally given additional clothing and so forth. But up to that time, I had religiously donated blood, money to the Red Cross. Since that day, the Red Cross has not gotten a drop of blood or a penny out of my pocket, to my knowledge of any of that. Nothing personal, but sometimes they touch a nerve and you just don't get over it. In any event, I finally got back to the United States, and as I said earlier, had an experience there at Alameda, was reassigned, picked up another ship, went back to the East Coast, and later on, at the end of the war, I was back in the Philippines and had enough combat time and overseas time that I was in the first ship that came back to the United States out of the Philippines, and was subsequently discharged in Camp Shoemaker, California. Now, one thing I would digress here for a second. Some people hold grudges. Some people are still mad at Japan. Some people are still mad at Germany. Those things didn't bother me. I was engaged in doing a job. I did my job. The enemy was engaged in doing a job. They did their job. But years later, I was in Canada, and one of my associates up there, a German fellow by the name of Adolf, and I were talking with a group of people one time, and this was maybe 8 or 10 years ago now. And the subject of the war, and who was in the service and so forth, happened to come up. Somebody asked Adolf, where were you during the war? He said he was in the German submarine service. And I asked him, I said, what area did you operate in primarily? He said, the North Atlantic. And he said, were you in the service? I said, yeah. And he said, where were you? I said, I was up there looking for you. This was on that, while we were engaged in that neutrality patrol. Another instance that has been amusing to some people since then. My dear departed wife was born in Japan. Her father was a captain in the Imperial Japanese Navy. It may have been in some of the battles that I was in, I don't know. But I get along fine with her family, her surviving family. I got along fine with Adolf until the day he died. I still get along with his widow. We have annual reunions up in Canada with retirees and so forth from the Teamsters that I was involved with. So times change, people change, and it kind of surprises me when I look at the current situation over in Iraq, where groups of people over there have been fighting each other for 1,000 years, and as far as I know, they'll continue fighting each other for another 1,000 years if they're given the opportunity. But I did not become involved in any of that, and the people that I know of did not become involved in carrying grudges like that. I have found out since, in my maturing years, that anybody that I have ever talked to that has been in combat, whether it's land, sea, air, they would not, under any stretch of the imagination, seek any more of it. Once you've been through it, you don't want any more of it. You would go if you had to, if it was necessary, but you wouldn't necessarily do it voluntarily like I did in the beginning. Now, I'm available for any questions that anybody would like to ask. Lots of things have happened that I didn't cover, but time is limited. And as one fellow told me one time, the mind will only absorb as much as the seat can take. So I appreciate your attendance and the opportunity to relay what I experienced, and hope that you enjoyed it. Thank you.
Questions? Any questions?
I have a couple of questions. The first one is, I don't know that much about warfare and strategies, but it seemed to me when we were watching the film that there's either an advantage to being on the ship shooting up at the airplanes, or to being in an airplane shooting down on the ship, or further to being a dive bomber. Which ones are most effective, and what the strategy revolved around seemed to be dive bombers delivered by aircraft carriers, is that right?
Well, the theory in those days, and it may have changed since then, the theory in those days was was they sent in the torpedo planes first, which would go in reasonably close to the water, drop their torpedoes. Then the dive bombers would follow the torpedo attack coming from a higher, much higher elevation and diving down. And hopefully, if the torpedoes didn't do their job, the dive bombers would. And then, depending on the amount of return fire, and as you probably noticed in the picture, all those black puffs, those are anti-aircraft projectiles that are exploding. And as I said earlier, they're set to explode at varying altitudes, which are determined by your fire control people. So let's say that they're set to explode at 5,000 feet if that's the altitude that they estimate the planes are at. As they explode, they blow out shrapnel. Now, nobody, I don't think, has an advantage. On the ship, you're firing with everything that you have to try and bring the airplane down, destroy the airplane before it destroys you. And from the airplane, you're trying to hit them before they hit you. So, in my opinion, everybody just has their fingers crossed and hope that I get him before he gets me. There's no better place to be, and none of the places are advantageous in my opinion. As an example, at Midway, an entire torpedo squadron, I forget how many planes were lost, but the entire torpedo squadron 8 was destroyed. They all made an attack, but were all shot down. They never returned to the ship. And this, incidentally, KLSE and Midway were before the days that the Japanese started using the kamikaze, where they would fly the plane into the target itself after they dropped their bomb or the torpedo, whatever they did. Then they would follow it up by driving the plane into the ship itself. But we didn't have that, although some of them came very close, but I don't think intentionally. But later on in the war, why they developed the kamikaze approach, where they sacrificed themselves for the basically for the emperor who they were fighting for.
One of the questions I asked Jim before when they finished the battle was, did anybody ever tell him who won? Because it was a pretty decisive victory for the U.S. Tell him your answer, Jim.
We didn't know. Nobody told us anything.
They had no idea that probably one of the greatest naval battles in the history of the United States was won by the United States, and nobody was going to tell them either.
All we were basically told is you don't talk about it. It's secret. So we didn't. At least I didn't. I assume none of the others did either.
When did you learn that you were able to talk about it?
Pardon?
When did you find out, when were you given permission to talk about it?
Basically, never was until it finally, there was an article somewhere in the newspapers. The news finally picked it up, and then by then it was sometime later. But the same thing basically happened when the Lexington sunk. Now we were with the Lexington in the KLSE when she was sunk. She was off of our starboard side, and when she went down, and I didn't hear any news about that either. So we heard all the later on we heard the Japanese ships were sunk, but I don't remember when I saw any news about either the Lexington or the Yorktown going down. The first ship that we lost in the war was the destroyer Reuben James, which was in the Atlantic when we were over there on the neutrality, on those neutrality patrols. And she was sunk by a German submarine. Now, there was quite a bit of publicity regarding that. But that was in 1941. Yes.
So going into the battle, you can fill in a few more details along the same lines that she was asking. Fill in a few more details. When you were going into the battle, how much did you know as to what the overall objective was? How much did you know about what the mission of the pilots on your ship were?
Nothing.
Were you just given instructions, fire your gun when they're coming at you, and that's about it?
They would sound general quarters, and you would go to your battle station and do whatever you were instructed to do.
Which is decidedly different from today's military, where they have much more
Now,
of a broad
the
knowledge.
pilots who were flying the planes and so forth, they of course were given targets and knowledge of to where they were to go. But as far as we grunts on the ship, why we didn't know. As an example, they would sound general quarters. You didn't know whether an attack was imminent or whether they were anticipating one, or hopefully, maybe just a drill. You didn't know until they gave the order to open fire, and then of course, and then when you had power, then those big guns, the ones that I was on, the 5-inch, they were all controlled automatically, as long as we had power. So somebody in the fire control operation was, as I said earlier, determining the altitude of the planes that they had on target, and the direction and location and so forth, and the guns would just, maneuver.
Right, but you would load.
Yeah, we would load them and actually fire them, yes.
Tell them about the time that you figured out abandoned ship, or how you found out about abandoned ship.
Well, did you have a number of power plants around in the ship? Auxiliary power plants?
There were auxiliary generators and so forth, but all of that went out.
Well, how could they all go out if they were independent?
Because of the damage that was done. Now, those that were not destroyed weren't sufficient to accomplish anything.
I see. So,
In other words, it's like if you have, let's say, 3 generators to run your home, in case of a power outage.
right.
And if 2 of them go out, the one won't be of any value.
But you've lost a lot of load, so you don't have to have a generator for each 3 guns or 2 guns, or maybe a generator on each gun.
Now that I couldn't answer you, because that's
Naval architecture.
that's somebody else's
Yeah,
duty. All my duty was to fire the guns. She'd see that it was fireable, and keep it loaded.
well, you've probably been on the Intrepid, the museum boat, or
Yes,
aircraft carrier on the Hudson River.
I
The Intrepid?
Yes.
Yeah, well, they rebuilt that thing after it was bombed down.
Right.
And nearly destroyed.
Right,
And of course, they made a lot of improvements.
right.
And
And that, of course, was the intention of the Yorktown, except they couldn't save her,
Yeah,
see? That's why she was in tow, and why the salvage party had come back aboard and so forth. But initially, she was abandoned, as I found out later, because of the fear that she was gonna roll over and everybody would be lost.
kind of a question related to this. Those so-called escort carriers, evidently President Ford was on one.
Yes.
And they mentioned that in this. I wonder how effective were they? They lost a lot of those. A lot
Yes.
of those were sunk. Did you see any, or?
We didn't didn't operate with any of those escort carriers, no. But the impression that I had when they first started building them was that they were initially, at least, designed to escort these convoys that were going from the U.S. over to Europe. And then subsequently, some of them saw other action as well. But they were not heavily armed, and they couldn't carry as many planes and so forth.
That's right. Evidently, they didn't defend themselves as effectively as.
I don't think they were equipped to defend themselves as effectively as the bigger carriers were. And see, with us, now I don't know about the escort carriers, but with us, we had destroyers, we had cruisers, at some points, we had battleships operating with our group, our task force.
Yeah.
So there was a lot of firepower, but it wasn't until approximately 1940, during fleet maneuvers in 1940, that the Navy finally started realizing the value of the aircraft during wartime, and consequently the aircraft carrier. Prior to that time, the old Navy heads, the only thing they could see were battleships.
Right.
And as an example, with the Saratoga and the Lexington, when they were first built, and they were built several years before the Yorktown, it started out as cruisers. Going to be, the keel was laid as a cruiser.
Yeah.
And then subsequently they were changed to carriers. But the size of the guns that they equipped them with, the big guns, and I don't know myself because I never served on either one of those, but it was either an 8 or 12-inch gun that they were equipped with, and they were in turrets, whereas the guns on the later carriers were all open. We didn't have turrets. But on the Saratoga and the Lexington, the guns were in turrets. And then they found out that the size of the guns were so powerful that they actually did damage to the aircraft that were on the flight deck when they were fired. So they had to reduce the size. And that's why we only had 5-inch, was the largest guns that we had. The Hornet had, the Enterprise and so forth, the Wasp and so on.
So your gun was open, you could see all around.
You could see all around, but you were limited because in back of you is the flight deck.
Right.
So you could only maybe, I guess maybe 180 degrees of horizontal motion. And the same with the machine guns, wherever they were located. As a matter of fact, I've seen several different versions. I referred to the fact that we got 2 fellows off the Yorktown the next day out of sick bay. I've seen 2 or 3 versions of how that happened. Those versions say that the destroyer Hughes, somebody on the destroyer Hughes, as she was circling the Yorktown the next morning, saw pinpoints of something hitting the water as she circled from the. So the story was that one of these men in sick bay had wrapped a bloody sheet around himself and climbed up to the hangar deck, which is below the flight deck, and fired a machine gun, and that was the little blips that had been observed by the Hughes, the man on the Hughes. Well, number 2, neither one of the 2 fellows in the sick bay were able to get out of their bunk. They were in no condition to get out. Number 2, if any of them had been in condition to get out and climb up to the hangar deck, the hangar deck is below the flight deck, and there were no machine guns, in my recollection, on the hangar deck, because if you were to shoot them up, you'd be shooting into the flight deck. And number three, if they had been able to climb up anywhere on the ship, why in the world would they then climb back down and get back into the bunk in sickbay? If they made it that far, I would think they would have stayed there. But as I say, neither one of them were in condition. Yes.
Your friend Adolph was on a U-boat in the Atlantic, and this is before 1941. And
This
you were on
has been early 41.
Yeah, early.
Yeah, we
were on
went into
neutrality.
the Atlantic, and I think it was April of 41.
I say, but you were on a neutrality escort. How did he feel about America's role in the neutrality?
How did he? I never asked you. I assumed he thought the same thing I did. Well, they're doing what they're supposed
Yeah,
to do.
okay.
You know, they're doing their job.
It's a matter of whose neutrality in their point of
That's
view.
right. That's right. And now Bob mentioned how asked how to relate how I discovered that we were abandoning ship on the Yorktown. As I said, where I was stationed, there were two 5-inch guns on this one partition of the ship, which is slightly built out over the side of the ship. Number 2 gun and number 4 gun. I was a gun captain on number 4. We have a gunnery officer, a gun officer, which in this case was a reserve lieutenant, a reserve ensign. And we also had a gunner's mate, a fellow by the name of Smith, as I recall, assigned to that battery, to take care of those 2 guns. During the second attack, I looked over for the gun officer. He was gone. I don't know what happened to him. Still don't know what happened to him. One fellow told me later on they found him hiding under his bunk in his cabin, but I don't know whether they did or not. The next thing I noticed, the gunner's mate had the earphones for the battery to receive the orders and so forth over the earphones. Next thing I noticed, he was gone. And then finally, as I said, we loaded gun number 4 again, unloaded it, and then got it ready to be loaded again. Number 2 gun was inoperable for the same apparent reason. It had jammed and they couldn't clear the jam. And somebody hollered down from the flight deck up above us and in back of us, abandoning ship. And that's the only way that I know. I'd still be there, I guess. You know, because there was no official word that came down. And I can remember climbing up. There was some ladders up to the flight deck, and I can remember climbing up, and everybody's heading to the high side of the ship. So I went back and told my crew, "Let's get out of here." But
No gong,
you
no
know,
whistle or anything.
during it, it's like the storm we just went through here in Seattle. When it happens, things don't go as they're always planned to go. And
Speaking of storms, did you ever ride through a typhoon?
yes, we went
That's
through
quite,
one.
quite exciting, isn't it?
We went through one. Now, normally, the Yorktown, and when in my younger days, I would do duty as a helmsman when I was on watch. Normally, to keep her on course, you would vary maybe 5, 6, 7 degrees of rudder. During this one blow that we went through, which was in the South Pacific somewhere, we were carrying 21 degrees rudder and still couldn't keep it on course. And I don't remember how high the hangar deck is on a big carrier like that, or even the flight deck and the hangar deck. but on the hangar deck, we were taking, water over the hangar deck. So it was blowing real good, yes.
Well, that was an interesting story you told about the Red Cross, because my father had a similar experience with the Red Cross, but it was concerning food, and he felt exactly like you did.
I've talked to many people who had contact with the Red Cross under similar conditions, such as you're talking about or what I experienced. And the reaction seems to be the same.
But it's interesting, there must have been some kind of policy or something.
I don't know what it was.
The same stories, and yours is the first I've heard to confirm it. I thought maybe my dad was just sort of,
Yeah, I've heard many fellows in the service that talked about the experiences they had with the Red Cross, and they were all basically the same as what I had, you know, not particularly good ones.
yeah.
Yes.
I won't recount it in detail, but I had an extremely fine experience with the Red Cross as a serviceman in the Aleutian Islands. And there are places, there are individuals that you will meet in anything, including in the armed forces, who are so bloody enthusiastic about doing what they think they're supposed to do that they don't pay attention to what they really ought to do.
It's possible.
It may be individuals. As
Could be a franchise operation, you know? Franchise operation, if you happen to be at Pearl Harbor, there was one franchise, and if you were in the Aleutians, there was another.
Yeah. Could be.
I have a neighbor across the street named Arthur Richter. He was a tank commander in the Second World War. In the Battle of Monte Cassino, which is a particularly bloody battle, he was on the American side shooting up. And about 25 years after the war, he went back to Monte Cassino, 30 years after the war. And they were sitting in a hotel, and across from them were a bunch of elderly German couples, and Rick was with his wife. And so they struck up a conversation with these German couples, and Rick said to them, "What are you doing here?" And he said, "Well, we're just coming back to one of the battles that I was in during the Second World War." And Rick said to him, "Well, which battle were you in?" He said, "The Battle of Monte Cassino." Rick said, "You mean you were up there firing down at the Americans down below?" And he said, "Yes." And Rick said, "Well, I was one of the Americans down below firing at you up above." And he said to the German gentleman, he said, "Well, tell me something. Why were you up there? What were you doing up there?" And in a very heavy German accent, the guy said, "I was just doing my job." And then the guy said to Rick, "What were you doing down there?" And he said, "I was doing my job too." Everybody was doing their job. Now, the other thing I've learned from talking to people like Dick Guth and Jim Farrington and Rick Richter is none of them ever want to be referred to as heroes. They were just doing their job. It's amazing to talk to different veterans in different wars, and they all say the same thing. I was just doing my job. I'm not a hero. That's the way things work.
The only heroes that I know of didn't make it. And a lot of guys did things that were unusual. But I've never, like Bob says, I've never talked to any of them that said, "Yeah, I was a hero." You know, I kiddingly refer to myself as one of the heroes and so forth, but I mean, it's a joke.
Well, our hero, there's an article in today's paper in the Times, this fellow that lives in Oregon, I guess he's a newspaper man and so on. He grew up in Arabia and was a close childhood friend of Osama bin Laden. Osama was a nice kid and quite a charismatic leader as a young soccer player and so on. But this fellow in Oregon, why, he became Western by his going to school here in Oregon and association. So maybe our job is just raising our kids.
Sorry to ask another question, but you heard the beating you heard the thumping on a ship? What was that, one of the sick people?
Never did determine where that came from. I to satisfy my curiosity later on, I convinced myself that it was some piece of metal somewhere in one of the compartments down below that, due to water action, you know, wave action and so forth, kept banging against something. Because what happened when we went aboard and I first heard it, I took a spanner wrench, which is a piece of metal, and I banged on the deck where there was a drain, a scupper opening that I could hear the noise coming through, and I banged in that area and there was no response. But as I say, I've satisfied my own curiosity because the next day when the large salvage crew came aboard, nobody was found anywhere in the ship that they went to, and I assume they went through all the compartments they could get into, you know. So, you know, a piece of metal swinging and banging like an open barn door or something that make a banging noise. At least
Thank you.
I've always hoped that's what it was. I'm not out of steam yet, if anybody. I'm old but not decrepit.
You're lucky. That's all I can say.
Yes.
How high was the jump when you jumped off the high end?
Well,
And what was it like?
I don't know what the measurements are, but higher than anybody in their right mind would do voluntarily.
It was about equivalent to about a 7-story building.
Oh my gosh.
And
Did you keep your shoes
I
on?
asked him that question before. I said, "How do you have the nerve to jump off a 7-story building?" And his response was, "I was young. What the hell did I know?"
Did you just go feet first, kept your shoes on?
Yeah. No, I took my shoes off.
Okay.
Yeah.
Were your feet sore afterwards?
No. And what happened when I went over, there were of course some life rafts and things, and I grabbed onto one of those until, as I say, the destroyer finally picked me up. But all covered with, you know, fuel oil and, yeah.
Most of us assume that it's a great loss to see your ship go down because you are so dependent
Well,
on it during that
I
time.
was more happy that I had survived than I was sorry that the ship had gone down, but yes, it's just like losing your home, because that's the only home you know. And the thoughts come to your mind, well, what's gonna happen now? Where am I gonna go? What are they gonna do to me now? Like I said earlier, when we went into Hawaii, and this was an experience that the cot I got that first night had a slit in it, so you're sleeping like that. You're not a happy camper the next morning. And one mistake that they made while we were in that, and I don't, there must have been 100 or so in the group that I was with that were at this Lua Lake, and they made a mistake. You don't give a bunch of 19, 20, 21-year-old single men beer. But one night they issued, I think it was 2 cans of beer per person. Well, not everybody drinks. So in your infinite wisdom, you figure out if you do drink, some way to get the beer from the guy that doesn't drink. So you're not limited to two cans of beer. Well, naturally, after a while, things got a little raucous, as they say, and the biggest complaint was the conditions. We were used to sleeping in clean bunks and having hot food most of the time and things like that. Here we are sleeping in a bunch of tents and on army cots, and no mosquito netting, anything like that the first first night or two. So we were not, as I say, happy campers. And it got to the point where the men assigned to this facility, whatever it was, were trying to calm us down and prevent what I don't think would have become a riot, but they thought it was going to become a riot. And I can still remember one of the old chiefs that was there. He had a Thompson submachine gun that he broke out, and he cocked it. I don't know whether he had anything in the chamber or not, but you know, you could hear him cocking it. So he's pointing it around and telling us to knock it off. And I got a little concerned when I heard him say my name. Now, you know, it's all right to be anonymous and so forth. You can get away with a lot of things when you're anonymous. But when they have your name, why then, you know, things start perking up a little bit. But in any event, that calmed down. And as I say, we finally got some mosquito netting and decent cots. And they took care of us eventually. Anything else?
Well, thank you very much